federal government spends a lot of money, about $6 trillion in 2022. That's about 25% of the gross domestic product, or GDP, a measure of the size of the economy, meaning that federal government spending accounted for about 1 out of every $4 in the economy. So where does all that money go? Federal spending can be divided into 3 slices. Mandatory spending is the biggest slice. It includes Social Security, Medicare, which is health insurance for the elderly, Medicaid, health insurance for the poor, and other benefits. In 2022, mandatory spending comprised nearly 2/3 of the budget. When it comes to these programs, Congress sets the rules: how Social Security benefits are calculated, who is eligible for Medicare, how much doctors and hospitals are paid for services, and then the government pays the bills. This spending is called mandatory because the government must pay for the benefits for anyone who qualifies. No further approval of Congress is needed. They are sometimes known as entitlements because those eligible for benefits are entitled to them. The second slice is discretionary spending. In this slice, Congress decides annually how much to spend and on what. Things like salaries for government employees, electricity for the national parks, foreign aid, missiles and tanks for the military. Discretionary spending was roughly 25% of federal spending in 2022. You sometimes hear complaints about how much taxpayer money goes to foreign aid. Even with the large increase in foreign aid to Ukraine in recent years, total foreign aid accounts for less than 2% of all federal spending. And what about all those bureaucrats? Salaries and benefits for all federal employees, including the military, accounted for only about 10% of all federal spending in 2022. The third slice is interest payments on the federal debt, about 8% of all spending in 2022. So where does the government get all this money? From taxes and from borrowing. In 2022, about 75% of spending was financed by taxes and 25% was financed from borrowing. The government collected about $4.9 trillion in taxes in 2022, 54% from individual income taxes, 30% from Social Security and Medicare payroll taxes, and the remaining 16% from corporate and other taxes. Let's put this all in perspective. Federal spending has been reasonably stable at about 21% of GDP for decades. Rising recessions like the Great Recession of 2007-2008, when, for instance, more people claimed unemployment benefits, or during the COVID pandemic, when the government spent heavily to help households and businesses. Federal revenues have been relatively stable at about 17% of GDP, falling in recessions as fewer people are working, so there's less tax revenue. In most years, the government spends more than it takes in, and when the government spends more than it collects in taxes, the difference is known as the deficit. The deficit in 2022 was 5.5% of GDP, a little larger than the average over the past 30 years. To pay for these deficits, the government borrows by selling treasury bonds. The federal debt is all the money the government has borrowed to finance past deficits. You can see that the federal debt has been rising sharply since the Great Recession of 2007-2008, and then again during the pandemic. In our next video, we'll talk about the future of spending, taxes, deficits, and debt. In the meantime, you can learn more about the federal budget and how to reduce the deficit by playing the Fiscal Ship at www.fiscalship.org.